The denial at the gate. The airport was alive, with noise and movement. Travelers rushed, with rolling suitcases. Children cried in tired voices. Announcements echoed through the speakers, and the smell of coffee drifted from the nearby stands. In the middle of this restless crowd, a black woman stood tall and calm, even though her eyes carried the weight of long years and hidden stories. She held a ticket in one hand and a small bag in the other, while beside her was a heavier suitcase that she struggled to keep steady. She had asked politely before when she reached the counter if someone could help her get the luggage to the boarding gate and up into the cabin, but the flight attendant, a young woman in a crisp uniform with perfect hair and a stiff smile, had refused in a way that cut through the noise. The attendant's voice was sharp, enough to be heard by those standing close. She said passengers should handle their own belongings, and rules were rules. Her tone was not neutral. It carried a quiet sting, the kind that made heads turn. The woman lowered her gaze and tried to swallow the sting of humiliation, because she knew too well how eyes could burn holes into her dignity. Yet she asked again, this time softer, hoping kindness might awaken somewhere in the attendant's heart. But again came the cold rejection. The attendant rolled her eyes and moved on to greet another passenger, as if the woman's presence was an inconvenience, unworthy of care, and the murmur started. In the line, some passengers whispered, some shook their heads, some smirked as if entertained by the small scene of power and weakness unfolding at the gate. The woman's hands tightened on the suitcase, her knuckles pale against the dark shade of her skin. She was not a fragile soul. She had carried burdens heavier than this in her life, but the cruelty of being denied in front of strangers bit deeper than the weight of her luggage. Her suitcase wobbled as she tried to lift it onto the scale. She leaned forward, her arms trembling, but she forced it up with sheer will. Her breath came heavy, her back ached, yet she pushed on because pride kept her standing. She would not let anyone see her break. Not here, not now. The attendant glanced at her with a dismissive smirk and tapped her polished nails on the counter, as if counting the seconds wasted on this one passenger. A little boy nearby tugged at his mother's hand and whispered loudly, asking why no one was helping the lady. The mother hushed him quickly and looked away, embarrassed, but in her eyes was a flash of shame. She had seen the cruelty, yet chose silence because silence was easier than standing up. The woman caught the glance and felt the sting of being seen yet abandoned. It was not the weight of the suitcase that hurt her most, it was the silence of so many, watching the refusal of one turning into the complicity of many. When the boarding call came, she steadied herself, gathered her bag and ticket, and walked forward, her steps heavy but steady. She knew the eyes still followed her. The attendant stood at the gate checking passes, her expression as smooth and artificial as glass. When the woman approached, she held out her ticket, her voice low but steady. The attendant scanned it without even meeting her gaze, muttering a dry instruction to move ahead. As she walked down the jet bridge, the air felt colder, the hum of the engines grew louder, and in her chest a storm of emotions battled. Pride against hurt, strength against weariness. She remembered all the times life had demanded she stand tall even when the ground wanted to pull her down, and she reminded herself she was not weak, she was not invisible. She would not let the cruelty of one stranger define her worth. But as she reached the door of the aircraft, she knew the memory of this denial would not leave her. Soon, for some reason, her spirit whispered that this moment was not just humiliation. It was the opening of something larger, something waiting to be revealed inside that plane. Whispers and silent tears inside the airplane. The cabin lights glowed soft and welcoming, yet for her the space felt narrow and heavy. Her steps were slow as she entered, with the weight of the earlier humiliation still clinging to her like an invisible chain. Passengers already seated turned their heads, some curious, some indifferent, some with pity in their eyes. She held her bag close to her chest, as if it could shield her from their gazes, and she tried to lift her larger suitcase into the overhead compartment. She pushed with all the strength in her arms, but the bag resisted, as if mocking her effort, and still no hand reached out to help her. A whisper began behind her, a woman muttering about how people should travel light if they cannot carry their own belongings. Another passenger laughed under his breath and shifted in his seat, pretending not to look but very much watching her struggle. The words reached her ears sharp like knives, cutting into her pride, and though she wanted to pretend she could not hear them, she felt each syllable land heavy on her heart. She gritted her teeth and pushed again, her body trembling, yet she refused to let her tears fall. Not here, not now. She had endured worse storms in her life, but there was something about the cruelty of strangers that dug deeper than any physical pain. It Last, she managed to wedge the suitcase into the compartment, and when it finally clicked into place, she let out a breath, shaky and rough. She lowered into her seat by the window, clutching her smaller bag on her lap, her chest rising and falling quickly. She closed her eyes, trying to calm herself, but in the silence of her mind, the whispers lingered, replaying over and over, and she could not escape theme. Man seated across the aisle leaned toward another and said something under his breath. They both chuckled, the sound low, yet piercing in the quiet moment. She opened her eyes and stared out of the window, her reflection. Looking back at her fragile yet unbroken, she blinked hard, willing the tears to stay hidden, but one escaped, rolling slowly down her cheek. She brushed it away quickly with the back of her hand, her face turning toward the window so no one could see. Yet she knew some had seen already, and their silence screamed louder than any word. The flight attendant passed through the aisle, her shoes clicking against the floor, her expression composed yet her eyes cold when they met the woman's. She gave a tight smile that was not kindness but mockery, then turned away to serve another passenger. The woman clenched her hands together, resting them on her lap. She whispered inside herself, words of strength, reminding herself that dignity lived not in how others treated her, but in how she carried herself through the fire. Still, the pain in her chest felt heavy as stone. The hum of conversations filled the cabin. People talking about vacations, about business trips, about families waiting on the other side of the flight, but none of their voices touched her. She sat alone in her quiet world, surrounded by strangers, yet isolated, as if invisible. She thought of her son far away, the pride of her heart, the one who had risen from humble beginnings to reach heights she once only dreamed of. She thought of his kindness, his strength, and his love for her, and in that thought she found a little warmth, enough to steady her breath. Still, the whispers did not stop. A young girl leaned toward her friend across the aisle and asked why the woman had not asked for help. Her voice naive, yet carrying the echo of judgment. The friend shrugged and muttered something about how some people just like to make a scene. Laughter followed, though hushed behind hands, as if secrecy made cruelty less cruel. The woman's shoulders sank slightly, but she kept her head high, refusing to turn toward them. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Tears gathered again at the corners of her eyes, this time not of weakness but of exhaustion, of carrying a lifetime of battles that the world never saw. Her quiet tears rolled silently, falling onto her hands where they glistened in the soft cabin light. She wiped them quickly each time, as if erasing evidence, but inside her chest the storm grew stronger, the whispers and the silent laughter mixing with memories of other times she had been denied, dismissed, ignored, yet survived. She remembered a time when she walked miles just to feed her child, remembered nights spent working her fingers raw so that he could have an education, remembered faces that doubted her worth and doors slammed in her face, and yet she endured and built a life where her son could rise and shine. Had carried all that, and now here in this cabin among strangers, she carried the sting of humiliation once more. But she reminded herself quietly that storms always pass, and that dignity once lost in the eyes of others can be restored in ways no one expects. The plane doors closed with a loud thud. The flight attendants moved briskly through the aisles, giving instructions. The captain's voice soon filled the speakers. Calm, steady, reassuring. The woman lifted her head at the sound, because there was something about it that stirred her heart, though she could not yet name why. She listened closely as he spoke of safety and weather and the flight path, his tone commanding yet gentle, and she felt a strange comfort in his words. As the engines roared to life, the passengers settled in, fastening belts, adjusting seats, pulling out books and devices. She sat still, eyes closed, a single tear slipping down once more, this time not of humiliation alone, but of longing for something she could not yet define. Her heart whispered that this journey was not ordinary, that the pain at the gate and the whispers in the cabin were leading to something greater, though she did not know what. And so she sat by the window as the plane began to move, her tears quiet, her pride still burning within her, her spirit whispering through the storm of humiliation that truth has a way of revealing itself when least expected. The confrontation in the cabin. The plane climbed higher into the night sky, engines roaring like distant thunder, while inside the cabin a quiet unease lingered, though laughter and chatter filled some rows in the space around her. There was stillness that weighed heavy. Her hands rested on her lap, her fingers curled tight as if holding back the storm inside. She wanted peace. She wanted to forget the sting of the denial at the gate and the whispers that followed, but cruelty once spoken never vanished. Easily it clung to her spirit like smoke. The Flight attendant made her way through the aisle again, pushing the cart of drinks, her polished smile reserved only for certain passengers. She greeted some with warmth, offered extras to others, but when she reached the woman, her smile tightened and her tone sharpened. She asked quickly what drink she wanted, not in kindness but in duty. The woman asked only for water, her voice steady though inside she longed for the comfort of silence. The attendant handed her the cup without meeting her eyes, then turned away swiftly, as if her presence was bothersome, and this time, a man 2 seats away chuckled softly, muttering that some people always want special treatment. The words carried across the aisle, sharp and cruel. The woman turned, her face back to the window, not answering, not reacting, but her chest tightened again. The attendant paused for a moment, hearing the comment, and instead of correcting the man, she allowed a smirk to cross her face. As if sharing in his mockery, the woman clenched her fists tighter beneath the fold of her dress. She was not a stranger to disrespect. She had grown up with it, worked through it, survived it, but here in the cabin, surrounded by strangers, the sting grew unbearable. She had endured in silence. 2 languor passengers sitting behind her leaned forward. A middle-aged man with kind eyes, he whispered softly that she should not pay attention to the cruelty around her, that people only mocked what they did not understand. His words were gentle, like a drop of water on fire, but they were not enough to quench the blaze in her chest. She thanked him with a nod, but inside, her pride demanded more. Her pride demanded she rise above the whispers and force respect from those who thought her weak moments. Later, as the cart moved forward, she pressed the call button above her seat. The small light blinked, drawing attention. The attendant returned her expression, strained her voice, asking curtly what the problem was. The woman lifted her chin, and in a calm, clear voice that carried through the rows, she asked why she had been denied assistance at the gate. She asked why she had been humiliated in front of strangers. She asked why compassion had not been shown when she had asked for nothing more than a helping hand. The cabin grew quiet. Passengers turned their heads, eyes wide, ears straining for the answer. The attendant froze, her lips parting, her face flushed as whispers spread like fire. The silence turned heavy, pressing on every seat. The woman's voice, though calm, carried the weight of years of battles fought in silence. She did not raise her tone, but every word cut sharp and true. The attendant stammered at first, muttering something about rules and fairness, but her words stumbled and fell flat against the truth, echoing in the cabin. One passenger near the front called out that he had seen what happened, that it had not been about rules, it had been about attitude. Another nodded, adding that he too had witnessed the dismissal. The cabin began to hum with voices, passengers shifting uneasily, no longer able to stay silent. The woman remained still, her gaze fixed on the attendant, waiting for honesty, but honesty did not come. Instead, the attendant stiffened her shoulders and tried to move on, muttering that she would speak with her later, but the moment had already shifted the balance in the cabin. Whispers that once mocked her now turned against the attendant. Passengers exchanged looks, some shaking their heads, some glaring openly. The woman felt a strange mixture of sorrow and power. She had not wanted a confrontation, she had wanted only dignity, but now, her quiet pain had forced the hidden cruelty into the open, and the cabin felt charged with tension as the plane leveled in the sky. The woman leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes, but inside her chest her heart pounded. She had stood against the cruelty, yet she still felt unsettled. She sensed something else looming, just beyond reach, something greater than whispers and denial, something waiting in the wings of fate. The attendant retreated to the galley, her face pale, her hands shaking as she whispered to another crew member. Passengers continued to murmur, their voices rising with judgment. The tension had grown too large to contain. Soon it would demand resolution, and the woman, though calm, knew that truth had only begun to stand as she sat by the window staring at the clouds glowing silver under the moonlight. Her tears had dried her spirit, no longer bowed by shame. She whispered silently to herself that storms always break when the sky can no longer hold them, and she felt in her bones that the breaking was near. The captain's steps in the cabin had settled into a tense silence, though the engines roared steady outside the windows. The weight inside felt heavier than the sky itself. Passengers shifted in their seats, their eyes moving toward the galley, where the attendant lingered, her composure cracked from the confrontation. Earlier the woman sat by the window, still and strong, her face calm, but her spirit braced. She knew storms never ended. With whispers alone, there was always another wave waiting, and she felt it rising. Moments later, footsteps echoed down the aisle, firm, steady, carrying authority without words. The captain entered the cabin, his uniform sharp, his shoulders squared, his presence drawing every eye as though the very air shifted to make room for him. His voice carried warmth and command as he greeted passengers, row by row, smiling, nodding, his eyes attentive to every detail. When he spoke, even softly, the sound carried strength that made people listen without resistance. He was the kind of man whose presence filled the space long before his words did. As he walked slowly down the aisle, thanking passengers for flying with them, the murmurs hushed, the attendant straightened, suddenly nervous, her face pale as his approach grew near. He stopped to shake a hand, to smile at a child, to ask about a passenger's journey, and in every gesture there was dignity and grace. Then his eyes moved forward and landed on her, the woman, by the window, and in that instant the steady rhythm of his steps faltered just slightly, almost unseen, but his eyes widened. His breath caught as if a memory long buried had risen from the depths. The passengers noticed the pause, their heads turning, the silence stretching as the captain stood there staring, his face shifting from composure to something raw and unguarded. The attendant glanced between them, confusion mixing with dread. The woman lifted her head, meeting his gaze, and for a moment the world around them vanished. She saw in his eyes recognition, not of a stranger, but of something deeper, something rooted in years gone by. And though she had held her pride in silence all this time, her heart stirred with both fear and relief. Captain's hand trembled slightly at his side, but his voice, when it came, was steady yet heavy with emotion. He addressed her softly, yet loud enough for those nearby to hear. His words wrapped in awe and reverence. He asked if she was all right, if she had been treated well. His tone was not casual, it was personal. It carried a depth that drew whispers once more across the rows. The attendant stiffened her jaw, her mind racing. She stepped forward to speak, but the captain raised a hand, stopping her without even looking her way. His focus remained only on the woman by the window. Passengers leaned closer, holding their breath, sensing that something greater than ordinary courtesy was unfolding before their eyes. The woman remained quiet, her chest rising and falling, her eyes fixed on the man before her. She had known this voice before she had heard it, as a child's laugh, as a young man's promise, as a son's devotion, and now, here it was, wrapped in command and uniform, yet still carrying the same truth of love. She had carried him in her arms once, and now the sky itself seemed to carry him in return. Captain stepped closer, bending slightly so his words reached her alone, yet still heard by all. He said with trembling pride that she was his mother, that the woman dismissed and humiliated at the gate, the woman mocked with whispers in the cabin, was the very person who had given him life and strength. The silence that followed was thunderous, the passengers frozen in shock, the attendant paling as if the floor had vanished beneath her feet. The woman's eyes filled with tears, though she fought to keep them from falling. She reached for his hand, gripping it with the strength of years of sacrifice, her lips trembling as she whispered his name softly enough that only he truly heard. Yet the sound carried like an unspoken truth through every heart in that cabin. The captain's shoulders shook just slightly, but he did not look away from her. Instead, he turned slowly, his eyes sweeping across the passengers, his voice rising clear and strong. He told them that everything he had achieved, every step he had taken, every dream he had chased, was because of the woman sitting by the window, the mother who had carried him through storms, who had worked herself to the bone to give him a chance in life, who had been denied by many, yet never denied him. Her love. His words rolled through the cabin like a wave, shattering the wall of whispers, leaving only silence and shame in their place. The attendant stood frozen, her lips parted but no words coming. Her earlier smirk now turned to ash in the fire of truth. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their heads, some wiping at eyes that had filled without warning, guilt heavy on their shoulders for having witnessed cruelty and done nothing. The boy who had earlier asked his mother why no one helped now stared wide-eyed at the captain, his small face filled with wonder and awe, as if witnessing something greater than any lesson he had ever learned. The woman sat still, her tears now falling freely, though her pride remained unbroken. She felt the weight of years lifting from her shoulders, her dignity restored, not by vengeance but by truth revealed at last. She had not sought confrontation. She had not asked for honor, but fate had placed her son here, in this moment, and through him, justice had spoken louder than whispers ever could. The captain, still holding her hand, promised in front of everyone that she would never be disrespected again, not while he had breath, not while his name carried weight in the skies. And as the engines roared outside, carrying them higher into the night, the cabin felt transformed. no longer a place of mockery but a place of revelation. And so in that moment, the storm that had begun at the gate swelled into its breaking point. And though the true reckoning was yet to come, every heart in that cabin knew that nothing would remain the same after the captain's words. Shocking revelation, the cabin remained frozen in silence, as if every sound had been stolen from the air. The steady hum of the engines was the only voice that dared break through, yet even that seemed distant, drowned beneath the weight of what had just been spoken. The captain still knelt by his mother's side, his hand wrapped firmly around hers, his eyes bright with unspoken tears. Passengers who moments ago whispered with judgment now sat stiff in their seats, unable to look directly at the woman they had mocked indirectly, unable to meet the gaze of the man who now stood as both captain and son. The attendant trembled where she stood, her perfectly composed face shattered into fragments of fear and shame. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came, only a faint gasp and the sound of her shallow breath. She looked at the other crew members for rescue, but none dared step forward, for the truth had struck too deep, and no shield could cover her cruelty now. The cabin itself seemed to turn against her, as eyes narrowed and heads shook slowly, each passenger remembering the quiet scene at the gate, each one reliving the moment. They chose silence when they could have acted. Their captain rose slowly, his tall frame commanding, yet his eyes still soft. When they returned to his mother, he took a breath, then turned to face the entire cabin, his voice deep, steady and heavy. With truth, he told them that the woman by the window was not just his mother, but the very reason he wore the wings on his chest. He spoke of how she worked day and night when he was a boy, how she went hungry so he could eat, how she walked through storms so he could reach school on time, how she endured humiliation so he could one day stand in uniform with pride. His words rolled through the cabin like waves crashing against stone, each passenger struck by the force of them. He said that to mock her was to mock the foundation of his life, that every honor he carried belonged first to her, that he would rather strip the wings from his chest than let anyone dishonor her dignity. Again his hand lifted slowly, as if to silence any murmur, though none dared speak, and he turned his gaze upon the attendant, his eyes sharp now, no longer soft. He asked her directly why she had treated his mother with such disdain, his voice calm but filled with a power that left her knees weak. She stammered something about following rules, something about not recognizing her need, but her words stumbled and collapsed under the weight of truth. Passengers began to murmur louder, now not whispers of cruelty, but of outrage. A woman near the back raised her voice, saying she had seen everything, that it was not about rules, it was about respect. Another passenger stood halfway, declaring that what had been done was shameful. Others nodded, voices rising until the cabin filled with a chorus of condemnation, directed not at the woman by the window, but at the one who had denied her dignity. The attendant shook her head, tears filling her eyes, her polished facade broken. She muttered apologies, but the sound was thin, fragile and empty against the truth revealed. The mother sat quietly through it all, her eyes lowered, her tears falling silently, her pride intact, yet her heart trembling. She had never wanted this storm. She had carried her burdens in silence for years, believing the world would never see her sacrifices, yet here in this moment, her son's voice had lifted her above the weight of shame, her dignity restored not only to her, but displayed before every stranger who once looked at her with judgment. She felt both sorrow and triumph, sorrow for the pain endured, triumph for the truth that finally shone like light through dark. Captain placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and warm, promising her without words that she was no longer alone, that she never would be again. Then he turned back to the cabin, his voice rising with finality. He declared that every passenger on this flight would remember this moment, not as a story of humiliation, but as a story of truth revealed. He said that dignity denied to one is dignity denied to all, and that silence in the face of cruelty is as sharp as cruelty itself. His words struck deep into hearts, piercing guilt into the passengers who had chosen silence earlier. Some wiped their eyes openly, some bowed their heads, some whispered apologies toward the woman, though they knew she might never hear them. The engines hummed steady, carrying the plane through the night sky, but inside the cabin a transformation had taken place. The air felt heavy with realization, every passenger confronted by their own choices and their own silence. The attendant stood broken, ashamed, unable to lift her head, the other crew members stiff, unsure how to move forward, and in the center of it all, the woman sat quietly, her strength no longer hidden, her truth no longer buried. She had been denied at the gate, mocked with whispers in the cabin, but but now she sat as the center of revelation, her dignity shining brighter than any uniform could contain. The captain took his seat once more, but even as he strapped himself back into the cockpit, his heart remained with her in the cabin he carried. The pride of a son who had spoken truth before the world, and the cabin carried the weight of a lesson. No passenger would ever forget the shocking revelation had shifted the air itself, turning whispers into silence, silence into shame, shame into respect, and respect into a vow that lived in every heart that heard it. And so the plane soared on into the night, carrying not just bodies but stories, carrying the truth of a mother's strength and a son's devotion, carrying the lesson that hidden worth cannot be denied forever, for when truth finally rises, it rises with a power no silence can contain. Respect restored, and a lesson remembered. The cabin settled into a silence unlike any silence before. It was not the silence of whispers holding back, it was not the silence of judgment hiding in the dark, it was the silence of realization, heavy and unshakable. Every passenger sat still, their eyes moving toward the woman by the window, no longer seeing her as a stranger, no longer seeing her as the weak figure they had mocked or ignored, but as a living pillar of strength, a mother whose sacrifices had built the very wings that carried them through the skies. She sat quietly, her head lowered, her tears still sliding down, but this time they were not only tears of pain, they were tears of release. Her dignity restored, her worth recognized, her love honored. The flight attendant remained frozen near the galley, her heart pounding, her chest tight, the shame pressing against her until she could no longer breathe properly. She had built her days on pride and appearance, believing her uniform and her smile could shield her from any weakness. But now, before the eyes of all those passengers and beneath the truth of her captain's words, she stood, exposed, her cruelty naked and undeniable. She stepped forward at her knees, trembling, her eyes red with tears. She whispered apologies to the woman, her voice shaking, her words stumbling, yet no one in the cabin rushed to comfort her. Because apologies once spoken under the weight of shame can never erase the scars already carved. The captain re-entered the cabin after securing the controls, his steps steady, his expression calm, but his eyes still holding the storm of emotion. He walked directly to his mother's side, taking her hand in front of everyone. He raised it gently and kissed it, his voice strong though wrapped in tenderness. He declared again that without her he would be nothing. Without her strength he would never have flown, without her love he would never have stood, and that to disrespect her was to disrespect him and every honor he carried. Passengers bowed their heads, many overcome with tears, many whispering soft words of regret. The boy who had asked earlier why no one helped now leaned against his mother and whispered that he would never stay silent again, and his mother hugged him tightly as if sealing a vow into his young heart. The woman lifted her gaze slowly, her eyes moving across the rows. She saw shame, she saw regret, she saw awe, but most of all she saw change. Her lips curved slightly, not in triumph but in forgiveness, for she had lived long enough to know that anger could break, but forgiveness could heal, and she wanted healing more than vengeance. She nodded gently as if granting mercy without words, and the passengers felt the weight lighten their hearts, easing though the memory of their silence would remain a scar they would carry forward as a reminder to act differently. The attendant fell to her knees near the woman's seat, her tears streaming, her voice pleading, saying she had been wrong, saying she had been blind, saying she had let arrogance guide her where kindness should have led. The woman looked at her quietly, her tears drying, her voice soft but steady. She said that dignity is not hers to give or take, that kindness is not weakness but strength, that respect should not wait for revelation but live in every act every day. Her words were simple, yet they carried the force of truth, and the attendant bowed her head lower, unable to reply, for she knew the words had pierced deeper than any punishment could have. The flight continued, the atmosphere transformed. Strangers spoke to one another, voices softened, apologies given not only to the woman but to each other. Passengers sharing stories of times they had stayed silent when they should have spoken, times they had looked away when they should have helped, and in that sharing the cabin became more than a vessel of travel. It became a vessel of truth, a place where every soul carried a new weight and a new vow. The woman sat quietly, her hand still held by her son, and for the first time in many years she felt the warmth of being seen, not as a burden, not as a shadow, but as the center of honor. When the plane finally descended, lights glowing on the horizon and the city stretching out below, no one moved with the usual rush. No one leapt to grab their bags or hurry to the exit. They sat waiting, as if reluctant to break The sacred air that had been built in that flight. The captain rose once more, and before dismissing the passengers, he asked them to carry forward the lesson of what they had seen, that silence in the face of cruelty is never neutral, that respect is the birthright of every soul, that the strength of mothers, fathers, and countless unseen sacrifices are the true foundations upon which greatness is built. His voice rang through the cabin like a bell, and no one doubted his words. The plane touched down smoothly, wheels kissing the earth, the engines roaring as they slowed, and when the door opened, the passengers rose slowly, many stopping by the woman to bow their heads or whisper quiet words of apology and thanks. Some held her hand briefly, some simply offered a smile, heavy with respect and gratitude. The attendant stood aside, her head lowered, unable to lift her eyes, the weight of her actions still pressing, but the lesson seared into her heart, never to be forgotten. As the woman stepped off the plane, her son by her side, his uniform shining under the lights of the airport, her heart swelled not with pride for herself, but with pride for him, for the man he had become, for the voice he had raised, for the truth he had spoken. She felt lighter than she had in years, her step steady, her tears dried, her spirit lifted. She had been denied help, at the gate mocked, with whispers in the cabin, but by the end of the journey her dignity stood higher than any insult could reach. And so the story closed, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with respect restored, and a lesson remembered by every soul who walked off that plane. They would carry it into their lives, they would tell it to others, they would remember the power of compassion, the danger of silence, and the hidden worth of those often dismissed, and in that remembering her pain would not be wasted. It would become a light, guiding others away from cruelty and toward kindness. The end.